Have you ever wondered who first tried to measure time? Not with sunlight or stars, but with gears and sound? Tonight, we turn back to an age when ticking was still a mystery, and clockmakers were closer to alchemists than engineers. Their machines didn't just count hours, they tried to understand the heartbeat of the universe. As you listen, think about how strange it must have been to build a device that could challenge the heavens. And if this story makes you curious, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think the world's first clocks truly measured, time or something deeper. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more quiet journeys through forgotten history, and let's begin with the forgotten science of medieval clockmakers. Long before cities had clocks on their towers or bells that divided the day into tidy portions, time moved like weather, unpredictable, silent, alive. The sun rose, shadows stretched, and people worked until they could no longer see their own hands. The passing of hours was felt, not measured. But in the centuries when cathedrals rose and empires turned their faces toward order, a small group of men began to wonder if time could be captured, not in books or calendars, but in motion, in sound, in the steady rhythm of a machine. They were the clockmakers of medieval Europe, craftsmen, philosophers, sometimes heretics, who tried to build order out of mystery. In an age when most people could not read or write, these men read gears and cogs like scripture. They called themselves horlogers, keepers of the hour, and though few of their names survive, their creations still whisper in the dark corners of old towns, where iron wheels turn slowly in the bell towers, echoing across centuries. No one can say exactly when the first mechanical clock began to tick. The idea did not appear in one place, but seemed to rise, like dawn, across different horizons at once. In the monasteries of the 13th century, monks grew restless with the silence between prayers. They had always relied on sundials and water clocks, but those slept at night. Someone, perhaps a nameless brother in a quiet workshop, imagined a way to make time continue even in darkness. He fastened weights to ropes, ropes to drums, drums to gears, and gears to a wooden wheel with teeth like stars. The wheel turned, released by a device called an escapement, a small lever that let time escape one heartbeat at a time. And when it worked, when the wheel began to move on its own, the monks must have stared as though watching the world breathe. In those early years, every clock was a secret. The knowledge of how to make one was guarded as fiercely as any relic. The clockmaker's art was a mixture of mathematics, blacksmithing, and intuition. They worked in hidden workshops behind cathedrals, shaping metal by candlelight, listening to the music of their own inventions. To make a clock was to imitate the heavens, to build a small universe where order reigned. The ticking was not just sound, it was proof that motion could have meaning. People came to hear the first clocks as they would come to hear sermons. When the bell struck the hour, villagers looked up in awe. To them, it was not machinery, but magic, a voice of metal calling out from the tower. Time, which had always belonged to the sky, now belonged to man. The ringing of hours became the new heartbeat of towns. Shops opened at the first bell, markets closed at the sixth, prayers rose at the ninth. The sound traveled through fog and snow, marking the rhythm of life like a pulse beneath the noise of history. But for the clockmakers themselves, the sound was something deeper. They listened to their machines as doctors listened to patients. Every tick, every uneven beat, spoke of friction, misalignment, imperfection. They adjusted, refined, reshaped. Some spent decades chasing accuracy they could never achieve. The materials betrayed them. Wood swelled, metal rusted, rope frayed. Still they tried. In their notebooks, they compared time to wind, to fire, to the human soul. They believed that by understanding the motion of gears, they might glimpse the motion of creation itself. In medieval towns, clockmakers occupied a strange place between craftsmen and philosophers. They were respected, but also feared. Ordinary people whispered that anyone who could trap time might also disturb it. There are stories, half myth, half memory. Of clockmakers who built machines so precise they were said to predict storms or deaths. When such things happened by coincidence, suspicion followed. A few were forced to destroy their own work to prove they were not dealing in forbidden arts. The irony was painful. Men who sought to understand time were punished for not accepting mystery. Yet even fear could not stop them. By the 14th century, mechanical clocks began to appear across Europe, in England, Italy, Germany, and France. Each one was unique, shaped by the hands and imagination of its maker. Some showed only the hours. Others displayed the motion of the sun and moon, the phases of stars, even the signs of the zodiac. These were not just instruments. They were cosmic diagrams, attempts to compress the heavens into gears. In Prague, a master named Mikulas of Kladno built an astronomical clock so intricate that it seemed alive. When it struck the hour, wooden figures moved. Saints, skeletons, angels, and kings. To the crowd below, it was a miracle. To Mikulas, it was mathematics made visible. The balance between faith and precision held the world together, one tick at a time. Behind each clock stood countless invisible hours of labor. The clockmaker worked with fire and metal, tempering brass until it rang like a bell when struck. He filed teeth into gears by hand, each one a fraction different from the next. He listened more than he spoke, attuned to vibrations that others could not hear. The air in his workshop smelled of oil and dust, of patience made tangible. Sometimes he fell asleep beside the mechanism, waking to the steady rhythm of his own creation. In those moments, time seemed to fold in on itself, the maker listening to the thing he had made, the machine measuring the hours of the man who built it. For centuries, these artisans existed in small numbers, passing their secrets from master to apprentice. They did not think of themselves as scientists, because science as we know it did not yet exist. But they were its ancestors. Each improvement, a lighter gear, a smoother escapement, a more accurate pendulum, was a step toward understanding motion, energy, and gravity. The first astronomers borrowed from them. The first physicists measured their work. Without clockmakers, there would be no modern timekeeping, no navigation, no science of precision. They turned faith into mechanics and mystery into measurement. And yet, with every advance, something was lost. The more accurate clocks became, the less personal time felt. The old water clocks had whispered, the new ones commanded. Bells that once called to prayer now dictated labor. In monasteries, the sound of hours no longer guided meditation. It interrupted it. Time had gone from being a companion to a ruler. The clockmakers, in giving humanity control, had also given it a cage. Few realized it at the time, but every tick was both a gift and a warning. Once measured, time could never again be free. Still, there were moments when the old wonder returned. Travelers wrote of climbing cathedral towers at midnight to watch the great gears move in torchlight, their shadows huge against the walls. They said it felt like standing inside the heartbeat of the world. The turning of the main wheel was slow, steady, deliberate, a meditation in metal. The air trembled with the weight of purpose. And when the bell finally rang, the sound carried for miles, rolling across valleys and rooftops, reminding everyone below that life, for all its chaos, still had rhythm. Some of those clocks still tick today. Their gears have been replaced, their faces repainted, their bells recast, but their souls, if such a thing exists in machinery, remain unchanged. They measure not only hours, but endurance. They have seen empires rise and fall, wars come and go, silence return and be broken again. Their ticking is no longer heard above the noise of modern cities, yet it continues, patient as breath. The forgotten science that built them never truly vanished. It simply blended into the background of daily life, where every phone and watch still carries the heartbeat of those first machines. The clockmakers themselves are gone. Their names are lost in archives, their tools rusted, their apprentices long scattered. But somewhere, Deep inside the sound of every ticking second, their legacy survives. Every time a clock strikes, it echoes back through 700 years of invention, faith, and wonder. The world may no longer look up to towers for the hour, but the towers still look down, their gears turning slowly in the dark, keeping time for no one, simply because they were made to. If you stand close to one on a quiet night, when the town is asleep and the air is still, you can hear the rhythm clearly. Tick, pause, tick. It sounds almost like breathing. Not mechanical, not human, something between. Perhaps that's what the medieval clockmakers discovered, though they never said it aloud. That to measure time is to join it. Every wheel, every gear, every strike of the bell is a small conversation between the living and the eternal. And in that conversation, the silence between ticks matters most. The hour before time was not about invention, but about listening to the stars, to the seasons, to the spaces between heartbeats. The clockmakers listened better than anyone. Their science, forgotten by name, still shapes the rhythm of our days. They did not capture time. They simply gave it a voice. And if you listen closely enough, in the quiet hours before dawn, you can still hear it speaking. To the medieval clockmaker, every wheel he carved was a fragment of the cosmos. Each tooth, each pivot, each weighted pendulum was more than metal. It was a symbol, a translation of divine order into movement. In an age when the heavens were considered perfect and the earth imperfect, clockmaking became a bridge between the two. The monks and craftsmen who built these machines were not simply trying to mark the hours. They were trying to imitate creation itself. The universe, they believed, was a vast clock wound by invisible hands, and their own small devices were echoes of that celestial rhythm. Inside the towers where these early clocks lived, there was a kind of sacred atmosphere. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, catching motes of dust that hung in the air like tiny stars. The machinery stood silent until touched. Then, with a single pull of a rope or push of a lever, the entire structure came alive. Iron gears meshed with groaning wood. Chains clinked. Counterweights descended slowly into the shadows. And then, the ticking began, deliberate, patient, unstoppable. Those who heard it for the first time said it felt like hearing the world think. The term the gears of heaven appeared in manuscripts of the 14th century. It was both metaphor and faith. For scholars of the time, astronomy and theology were not opposites. The same God who made the stars had also given men the intelligence to mirror them in iron. To understand the motion of a gear was, in a small way, to understand the motion of planets. And so, clockmakers studied the sky as much as metal. They charted lunar cycles, solar positions, and the slow turning of constellations. They built not only our clocks, but entire auroras, mechanical models of the heavens, where small brass spheres represented planets orbiting an unseen center. To see one of these machines move was to see harmony itself, reduced to scale and sound. The great cathedrals became laboratories of time. In Chartres, in Salisbury, in Rouen, towers filled with scaffolding and rope became sanctuaries of mechanical devotion. The ticking of the clock was a second kind of prayer, an unending one. Monks who once measured their lives by the bell began to measure the bell by the clock. In the quiet hours of night vigils, they would pause and listen to the machine whispering in the dark, its rhythm steady as breathing. Some wrote that the sound reminded them of the creation story, the moment order rose out of chaos. The gears of heaven, turning below, were proof that the divine could be understood through patience. Yet this closeness to perfection came with danger. To imitate heaven was, in some minds, to challenge it. A few scholars warned that mechanical clocks made men arrogant, that by measuring time too precisely, they were trying to control what should remain mysterious. In some towns, the first tower clocks were greeted not with admiration but unease. When one malfunctioned and struck 13 times instead of 12, people whispered that the devil had turned the gears. The line between science and superstition was as thin as a strand of brass wire. Still, the clockmakers continued, believing that order was worth the risk. In the workshops, the process of making these heavenly machines was both brutal and delicate. Hammers struck anvils, sending sparks into the air. Molten metal hissed as it met water, hands burned and calloused. Yet in the same moment, those same hands adjusted the angle of a wheel by less than a hair's width, because they knew that one misaligned tooth could throw off the rhythm of the universe they were trying to create. The air smelled of oil and ash and ambition. The sound of filing metal mixed with humming, not songs, but the rhythmic low hum craftsmen make when concentration replaces thought. Each workshop had its own music, and in that music, the first laws of physics were written not with numbers, but with sound. As their skill grew, so did their courage. Clockmakers began building machines that did more than count hours. They moved figures, told stories, imitated life. In Strasbourg, an enormous clock unveiled in the 1570s became a wonder of the world. Every hour, doors opened, and mechanical apostles walked across a stage of gears. A skeleton rang a bell, reminding onlookers that time belongs to death as much as life. Crowds gathered below, watching the show of eternity turned into performance. The people gasped, laughed, crossed themselves. To them, it was a miracle. To the clockmakers, it was proof that precision could make faith visible. No one thought of these machines as mere instruments. They were teachers. Each moving part represented something unseen. The large wheel for the sun, the smaller for the moon, the slowest for destiny. Watching them turn was a meditation on existence. Everything in motion, everything connected. And because of this, the clock became a kind of philosophy. To maintain it required discipline. To understand it required humility. The slightest dust could halt the entire system, reminding its maker that perfection demands constant care. Even the gears of heaven could falter if forgotten. In towns across Europe, towers rose taller, not only to defend or inspire, but to hold the clock's voice higher. The ringing of bells became the soundtrack of civilization. From dawn to dusk, people no longer looked to the sky for time. They listened. The hour was no longer celestial, it was mechanical. But in that transformation, something profound occurred. Time became democratic. The same bell that told monks to pray also told merchants to open their stalls, farmers to return from fields, and children to run home before dark. The gears of heaven had descended into daily life. The sound of a bell was the voice of order speaking equally to all. Even so, not all clocks endured. Some rusted, others burned in fires or were dismantled for war. The knowledge of their makers faded, surviving only in fragments, sketches, diagrams, strange notations in the margins of manuscripts. Modern restorers study these fragments like archaeologists of motion. They find ratios scribbled in Latin, calculations for weight, and torque beside prayers written in ink. In one notebook found near Lubeck, an anonymous craftsman had written, "He who sets the wheel sets the world." Beneath it, in a smaller hand, someone had added, "Only if the world allows." Even then, they knew that time, for all their mastery, remained beyond their control. The deeper one studies those ancient mechanisms, the more their makers resemble poets rather than engineers. Their machines were metaphors made solid. The great gear that turned once a year was the earth. The smaller that turned daily was man. Between them, endless motion. Each tooth in a wheel represented a moment, and as the wheel turned, the moments passed, not lost, but reused over and over as the cycle repeated. The clock was not just a measure of time, it was a rehearsal of eternity. And yet, even as the clockmakers reached toward the divine, they remained grounded in the ordinary. They worried about wages, food, the cost of brass. They argued with patrons, cursed broken tools, nursed injuries from molten metal. Their genius lived alongside exhaustion. Some died before finishing their work. their apprentices left to interpret unfinished diagrams. When those apprentices succeeded, they added their own flaws, their own fingerprints. The machines became family trees of imperfection, each generation learning, correcting, and sometimes repeating mistakes. In that way, the clocks were human after all. Today, when historians and craftsmen restore these ancient marvels, they describe a feeling that is hard to name. It happens the moment the old gears begin to move again after centuries of silence. The first tick is hesitant, as if the machine is surprised to find itself alive. Then the rhythm settles, steady, inevitable. The air changes. The sound fills the tower like breath returning to lungs. The restorers often fall silent. They know they are hearing not just metal, but memory, the continuation of a conversation started long before their birth. If you visit one of these towers at dusk, when the last light fades through stained glass, you can feel it too. The clock's gears glint faintly in the half-light, their slow turning almost hypnotic. The sound rises into the rafters and out into the evening air, merging with the calls of birds returning home. For a moment, it feels as if the world itself is balanced on those wheels, the sky and earth turning together. The gears of heaven, still working, still keeping faith with motion. The clockmakers never truly disappeared. Their descendants build satellites and atomic clocks now, measuring time with particles instead of pendulums. But the spirit is the same. They still chase the harmony between movement and meaning. And though their tools have changed, the wonder remains. The universe is still a mechanism waiting to be understood, and humanity is still listening for its tick. In the quiet hours, when the machines of the modern world fall still, their hum replaced by distant wind or rain, the memory of those first gears stirs again. Somewhere, a tower clock keeps time for no one, its hands moving in darkness, its bell ringing unheard. And in that sound, faint, faithful, eternal, the dream of the medieval clockmakers survives, that the world, however chaotic it seems, still moves in perfect rhythm, one tick at a time. When the first mechanical clocks began to keep time, they needed a home that could match their rhythm, something tall enough to let their sound reach the living and strong enough to bear their weight. That home became the tower. At first, it was only a convenience, a practical solution, a high space where the falling weights of the mechanism could hang freely, where the bell could be heard across a town. But over time, the tower became more than architecture. It became the lungs of the city, the place where stone began to breathe. Each tower was a voice box built from faith and physics. Its shape gathered sound the way a shell gathers the sea. When the bell rang, the vibration traveled through the walls, into the air, and through the streets. The clock's rhythm became the rhythm of the town itself, opening and closing markets, waking bakers, dismissing laborers. For those who lived nearby, life was lived between the bells. A day without a ring felt incomplete, as though the world had forgotten to inhale. In the beginning, there were few of these towers. A single town might have only one, rising above roofs like a sentinel of order. The people called them the breathing towers. They believed the bells drove away storms and spirits, that the sound itself purified the air. And perhaps it did. For centuries before clocks, bells were humanity's loudest instruments. They marked danger, victory, birth, death, and prayer. When clockmakers joined their machines to those bells, they gave structure to that sound, a steady rhythm instead of chaos. It was as if the towers, once asleep, had learned the pattern of breath. Inside, the heart of the tower was not light or grandeur, but mechanism. The gears hung like organs suspended in ribs of wood and stone. The air was warm from friction, oily from years of maintenance. When the clock struck, dust trembled from beams in slow golden clouds. If you stood there at noon, you could feel the building vibrate, a living creature with lungs of iron and a heartbeat made of sound. Some monks said the towers prayed louder than any choir. The towers also changed how people understood the sky. Once, Men had looked upward to guess the hour. Now they looked upward to see it. The dials became faces, the hands became eyes. A town could tell its own time just by glancing at its tower. Each community's heartbeat was slightly different. One clock ran fast, another slow. When travelers moved from village to village, they carried time with them like a rumor, discovering that the world did not tick in unison. This unevenness made time human again, imperfect and local. A tower's clock was as distinct as a dialect. The builders who raised these towers often worked with limited knowledge and limitless faith. Their scaffolds swayed in wind, their ropes frayed, their stones cracked in frost. But they continued, driven by a belief that height itself could bring clarity. The higher the bell, the purer its tone. The higher the clock, the clearer its rhythm. At the top of these structures, where air thinned and gulls circled, the builders carved small crosses or suns, symbols of light. They were not only marking completion, they were giving their towers breath. For centuries afterward, when lightning struck a tower, the townspeople said it was not punishment but a gasp, the tower exhaling the storm. Some of the earliest towers had no stairs, only narrow ladders. The clockmaker who maintained them lived like a solitary guardian, climbing daily to wind the mechanism. He carried a lantern and a small tin of oil. Each step upward was a meditation. Each step downward, a return to the world of mortals. His hands bore the scent of iron, his clothes a dust that no washing could remove. At night, when the clock was still and the wind moaned through the vents, he would sit beside the gears, listening to their faint clicking as they cooled. He said it sounded like breathing, the tower resting until dawn. There are letters from the 15th century written by such men. One describes the moment the bell rang for the first time after weeks of labor. It was as if the stone itself drew breath, he wrote, and spoke in a voice of thunder. Another complained that villagers cursed him for disturbing their sleep. They forget, he wrote, that sleep is also measured. For these caretakers, timekeeping was both blessing and burden. A life spent listening to the same rhythm, knowing it would continue long after their own stopped. The sound of the bell was not just heard, it was felt. In narrow streets, the vibration rippled through windows and doors. Mothers used it to time their meals, sailors to set their watches, children to end their games. The bell's echo lingered in the walls like warmth after sunlight. When a tower fell silent, because of war, neglect, or death of its keeper, people said the town felt wrong, like a body forgetting how to breathe. Some communities lit candles at the base of broken towers, praying that sound would return. Silence, they believed, was dangerous. In times of siege, the towers became targets. An enemy who silenced the clock silenced hope. The ringing of hours was the rhythm of endurance. Without it, the defenders lost their heartbeat. Many towers were rebuilt again and again, their stones blackened by fire, their bells recast from the melted remnants of war. Each resurrection added another layer of history to their walls, scars that became memory. The towers learned to survive, and with each rebuilding, their voices grew deeper, as if aged by experience. As centuries passed, the technology inside evolved. Pendulums replaced weights, springs replaced ropes, and the mechanisms grew smaller, more precise. But the soul of the towers, their breathing, remained the same. When engineers climbed to repair them, they often paused, listening to the deep, steady pulse of gears echoing off stone. The sensation was physical, like standing beside a giant sleeping animal. Some described it as comforting, others as humbling. Few could leave without feeling changed. Today, many of those towers still stand. In city squares and quiet villages alike, they continue to inhale and exhale time. Tourists photograph them, unaware that inside, hidden behind glass and wire, the old hearts still beat. The air there is thick with dust and oil, the smell of centuries at work. When modern restorers wind the old mechanisms by hand, the first turn of the crank feels sacred. The gears shudder, then begin to move, their rhythm familiar yet impossibly ancient. It is the same breath the builders heard 600 years ago, returning once more to the surface of the world. Sometimes, when fog covers a town and bells ring unseen through the mist, people still pause to listen. The sound seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It rolls through the air like a sigh, soft but certain. For a brief moment, even the noise of traffic yields. The towers continue their breathing, unnoticed yet essential, keeping time not for the clocks below, but for the world itself. If you ever find yourself standing beneath one of these towers at midnight, when the air is cold and still, look upward. The face of the clock might glow faintly, the hands motionless for a heartbeat before moving again. Listen closely, and you will hear it. The low creak of wood, the quiet exhale of wind through the vents, the slow tick that never ends. That is the tower breathing, not for itself, but for everyone who has ever measured a moment and called it life. The clockmakers gave us time. The towers taught it how to live. And those centuries have passed. Though the world now counts seconds in silence and pixels, the old towers continue to remind us of a truth too simple to forget. Every breath we take is a borrowed second. Every heartbeat an hour struck softly in the distance. The towers learned to breathe so that we might remember to do the same. Before the world could see time, it heard it. In the centuries before watches, before glowing screens and digital tones, the passing of hours was not something you looked at. It was something you felt in sound. The world moved to rhythm, not precision. And that rhythm came from bells, chimes, and echoes, crafted by hands that understood that sound could be sacred. Long before science learned to measure frequencies, bell makers were already sculpting harmony out of fire. Their furnaces glowed orange in the corners of medieval towns, hidden behind heavy wooden doors. The air smelled of molten metal and wet clay, of burning straw and iron filings. From this mixture of earth and patience came the instruments that would teach humanity to listen for time. Every bell was unique, as personal as a voice. The best bell makers said a perfect tone was not made. It was found, waiting inside the metal like breath inside a lung. Their art was to release it. When clockmakers and bell makers met, a new partnership began, one of motion and sound. The gears could measure, but only the bells could make that measurement real. Without them, time remained invisible. It was the bell that turned a turning gear into a heartbeat, the bell that made the invisible visible. The first time a town heard its new clock strike, people described it as both beautiful and unsettling. To hear the hours was to be reminded that they existed. It was as if the air itself had learned to count. In the beginning, the ringing of hours followed no strict pattern. Some towers struck once for each prayer, others for each trade. A farmer might hear 6 bells before dawn, a merchant 12 before lunch. Time was not yet uniform. It was shaped by purpose. The rhythm of the bells told you not only when you were, but who you were. The baker's morning began earlier. The scholar's day lasted longer. The monk's night broke for prayer. The sound of bells filled every space between silence and work. It was a world conducted like music, each town playing its own quiet score. Over centuries, the language of sound grew more complex. Bell makers learned how the size, shape, and thickness of metal changed its tone. They tuned bells by ear, striking them softly with mallets, listening for vibrations that lingered in the bones as much as in the air. Some would spend months on a single bell, adjusting its mouth by fractions of an inch until the sound carried just right across a valley. It was not just craft, it was devotion. The ringing of each bell was a prayer to precision, a kind of science disguised as song. When those bells joined the gears of clocks, time gained a voice unlike any other. A clock might mark the hour with a single deep note, or with a melody that repeated through the day. In Italy, they called it il suono del tempo, the sound of time. In France, la musique de heures. And in England, where towers dotted the hills, the bells became so familiar that people said you could tell your distance from home by how the chimes sounded through fog. Each tone carried identity. A traveler could close his eyes and know where he was, guided by sound instead of stars. But there was something else beneath the beauty, a strange comfort in repetition. The ringing of hours reminded people that they were part of a pattern larger than themselves. No matter what happened, births, wars, harvests, losses, the bells continued. They were the voice of endurance. In villages ravaged by plague, the last surviving monks would still climb the towers to strike the bell, not to tell time, but to keep hope alive. The act itself was resistance against chaos. As long as time could still be sounded, the world had not fallen silent. Inside those towers, the mechanism that made the bells speak was as intricate as any living organism. Iron hammers lifted and fell with the precision of breathing. The escapement, the small device that released the gear teeth one by one, clicked like a pulse. Chains wound slowly, counterweights descended, and the bell swung outward, releasing its voice into the open air. The sound expanded in waves, rippling across rooftops and rivers. Birds startled, dogs howled, children counted. The world answered back to its own heartbeat. And then came the wind. The wind changed everything. It could carry a bell's voice for miles or swallow it completely. It could bend its pitch, soften its edge, turn triumph into lament. Clockkeepers grew to love the wind for this. Its unpredictability made each strike different. Some said the bells spoke a new language every day, depending on the air. The harmony between machine and nature became a secret conversation no one else noticed. Even silence, when the wind refused to carry the sound, became part of the music. Yet as centuries passed, people grew impatient with sound. The industrial world brought more noise. Engines, factories, crowds. The bells that once guided lives became background hum. Their melodies lost meaning. Their harmonies drowned in machinery. New clocks no longer needed voices. The ticking inside pocket watches replaced the ringing above cathedrals. Time became private, internal, no longer something shared by a whole town. It became a secret each person carried alone. The sound of time was forgotten. Bellmakers still worked, but fewer came to listen. Their apprentices left for more modern trades. The last great foundries cooled, their furnaces silent. The language of resonance, of overtone and vibration, faded from memory. Today, only a few craftsmen remain who can tune a bell by ear. They strike it softly, listen, and nod. Hearing layers of sound most people cannot even sense. In their faces, you can see both pride and sorrow. Pride in a skill that defies time. Sorrow that time itself has outgrown it. And yet, even now, when a bell rings through a quiet evening, something stirs. The air still vibrates with memory. The tone still finds its way into the human heart. No one taught us to feel it. It is older than language. The art of sounding time may be forgotten, but its echo remains. In the hush after the last note fades, in the way the mind pauses to listen without realizing why. The sound still speaks to something ancient in us. The part that knows we are passing, that every second, every breath is borrowed music. There are towns where the bells still rule. In Italy, the monastery of Monte Oliveto Maggiore keeps its 600-year-old clock in working order. The monks there wind it by hand, as their ancestors did. When it strikes, the sound moves through olive trees and stone courtyards, rising into the hills. The brothers say they can tell the age of the air by how the bell sounds. Some nights it's sharp and bright, others it's soft and distant, like memory itself. They call it the breath of the day. To them, time is not measured by seconds. It is inhaled and exhaled. If you listen closely, you can still find the lost art in motion. A tower bell striking through mist. A ship's bell echoing across a harbor at dawn. The faint tolling of a church deep in the countryside, counting hours no one watches. Each sound is a ghost of the old harmony, the world remembering how to sing to itself. The gears may have grown smaller, the bells fewer, but the rhythm continues, steady, patient, eternal. To sound time is to admit that silence has value. Every ring must end. Every echo must fade. The medieval clockmakers understood this. That is why their bells were shaped not only to speak, but to vanish beautifully. The curve of each rim, the hollow beneath, the thickness of its edge, all were designed so that when the note died, it left peace behind. The best bell makers said the art was not in the sound itself, but in how the silence felt afterward. That silence was the true measure of perfection. And so, perhaps the art is not truly lost. It waits, quietly, in every moment when the world pauses, between one heartbeat and the next, between one tick and another. The bells still ring somewhere, even if we no longer stop to listen. And the next time you hear one through rain or distance, close your eyes for a second. Feel how the air changes, how time itself seems to lean toward you. That is not just a sound. It is history breathing. The lost art of sounding time was never about making noise. It was about reminding us that time, like music, means nothing without listening. And though the world may have forgotten that lesson, the bells have not. They wait patiently in their towers, their ropes and wheels ready, their voices tuned to the rhythm of eternity, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen again. Every clock, no matter how beautifully built, eventually falters. A tooth wears down, a rope frays, a weight slips too low. Time itself never stops, but the machines that measure it do. And when that happens, someone must climb the tower. Someone must listen, diagnose, and breathe life back into the hours. In the quiet centuries of medieval and early modern Europe, those someones were the men who repaired the hours, the silent guardians of time. They were not famous, though their work touched every life that heard a bell. They were part blacksmith, part philosopher, part acrobat. Their hands bore the marks of both skill and solitude, burned from oil, cut by wire, stained with dust. Few saw them work. They moved through stairways and attics, through hidden chambers behind the clock faces, their tools clinking softly in the dark. While others slept, they kept the heartbeat of the town alive. Most of them began as apprentices to clockmakers. Some inherited the work from fathers or uncles. Others simply learned by necessity. In small villages, there was often only one man who understood how the clock moved. And when he grew old, he would choose a boy to teach, passing down not just knowledge, but trust. For these men, repairing a clock was not a trade, it was a vow. The mechanism was alive, and they were its caretakers. To neglect it would have been like abandoning a friend. The work was dangerous, but beautiful. Inside the towers, the air was cold and filled with the smell of iron and dust. Pigeons fluttered through broken windows, their feathers catching sunlight that filtered through the clock face. The gears towered like architecture within architecture, some taller than a man. A careless step could mean a fall from 30 feet, a moment's distraction, a crushed hand. But they moved slowly, listening. The good repairers never forced anything. They said each machine had its own temperament, some obedient, some stubborn, some quiet until you earned its trust. The first task was always the same, to listen. They would sit for minutes, sometimes hours, watching the gears turn, feeling the vibration through wood and stone. A misplaced tooth produced a soft knock, a bent pivot a faint hiss. The men could read these sounds as easily as others read words. They spoke of sick clocks and tired wheels, describing each fault as if it were an ailment of the body. A slipping weight was a weak pulse, a frozen escapement, a stopped heart. When the repair was complete and the ticking returned to its steady rhythm, they said the clock was breathing again. And in a way it was. There is a story, written in the margins of an old ledger from Cologne, of a repairer named Hans. One winter, the great clock in the cathedral stopped during a storm. The bell hung silent, frozen by ice. Hans climbed the tower at night with only a lantern and a hammer. For hours he chipped away frost from the gears until his fingers bled. When he struck the bell to test it, the sound rang across the snow-covered town, waking the sleeping streets. The people thought it was a miracle, the return of time itself. No one saw Hans, shivering beside the mechanism, smiling faintly. He was not a hero, only a servant of hours. To repair such a clock was to step into history. Many of the machines they tended had been built by hands long gone. Their makers were names carved on brass plates, their apprentices forgotten. The men who repaired them felt this weight, the presence of the past, in every wheel and gear. They touched the same metal that others had touched centuries earlier, continuing an unbroken conversation through time. One wrong move could erase years of work. One careful turn could preserve it for another generation. Every sound in the tower, the click, the creak, the faint hum, was a voice from history asking not to be forgotten. The repairers were also keepers of secrets. They knew the hidden spaces of their towns, the hollow passages behind dials, the winding stairs no one else climbed, the dusty alcoves where pigeons nested beside saints carved in stone. They often carried small tools shaped to their hands, wrapped in oiled cloths, each one passed down like a relic. When they worked, the rest of the world disappeared. Outside, markets buzzed and bells rang, but inside the tower, there was only ticking and breath. Many of them said they could tell the hour without looking, not by sound, but by feel. Time, to them, was tactile. Sometimes, when the damage was beyond repair, they improvised. A broken gear might be mended with wire, a missing tooth carved from oak. These temporary fixes often lasted decades. Later craftsmen would find them and marvel at the ingenuity, the quiet cleverness of men who had no machines, no blueprints, only instinct. A few left their initials etched small on the inside of panels, invisible unless you dismantled the clock. It was their way of saying I was here. I kept time alive. The hardest part of their work was not the height, or the danger, or even the cold. It was the loneliness. They spent hours alone in spaces filled only with sound. Some grew so used to the rhythm of ticking that they could not sleep without it. When the clocks they tended stopped for long repairs, they described feeling restless, as if their own hearts had lost their beat. Others said they dreamed of gears turning endlessly, great circles that moved through the darkness like constellations. To repair the hours was to live inside them, to become part of their motion. Every repairer had a favorite sound. For some, it was the soft clack when the escapement caught. For others, the deep, rounded tone of the bell just before the strike. They said each tower had its own voice, and they could recognize them instantly. In letters exchanged between repairers of different towns, they wrote of their clocks as friends. "Your bell sings sharper than mine," one wrote, "but mine has more patience." There was a quiet fraternity among them, a brotherhood of listeners. They met rarely, yet understood each other completely. When towns modernized, many of these men found themselves out of work. Electric motors replaced winding cranks, and precision tools replaced the need for instinct. Some were hired to oversee the new systems. Others simply walked away, their hands suddenly empty. In the early 20th century, newspapers described the last of them as relics, keepers of forgotten time. But even then, a few refused to leave their posts. They climbed the same stairs, checked the same gears, wound the same ropes. To them, the clock was not a machine. It was a living memory. In France, one of these men, a repairer named Émile, kept the cathedral clock in Rouen running for 60 years. When he retired, no one else knew how to wind it. The mechanism fell silent within months. People noticed immediately. The town felt wrong, unanchored. They brought Émile back. At 83, he climbed the tower once more, his steps slow but sure. When the bell rang again, he wept. "The tower breathes," he said softly. "It was only sleeping." He died the following spring. The clock still runs. There is something deeply human in their devotion, the willingness to serve something that will never thank them, never remember them, yet will outlast them all the same. The men who repaired the hours worked not for recognition, but for continuity. They knew that the value of their craft lay not in invention, but in preservation. They did not seek to make time new. only to keep it moving. In their patience, there was a kind of peace. If you ever visit an old European town at dawn, before the noise of day begins, listen closely. Somewhere, far above the roofs, you may hear a faint metallic sigh, a gear turning, a chain lifting, a clockkeeper winding his charge. It is a sound as old as faith, as soft as breath. The men who repaired the hours may be gone, but their work continues in every restored mechanism, every tower that still beats like a heart against the sky. They kept the world breathing, one careful turn at a time. And perhaps, in the silence between ticks, you can still hear them. Their footsteps on the stairs, their murmured notes, their quiet satisfaction when the sound returns. They were not chasing progress or perfection. They were simply listening, as all true caretakers do, for the moment when the world remembers how to move again. There are clocks that keep time, and there are clocks that outlive it. Scattered across the towns of Europe are a few that seem to defy reason. Machines built when the world still believed in miracles, still lit its nights with flame, and yet they continue to move. Their gears have been replaced, their weights recast, their caretakers changed 100 times, but the rhythm never faltered. They have watched centuries pass from the same stone towers, through wars and peace, frost and summer, silence and song. They are not just clocks. They are memories that refuse to die. Among these survivors, one name appears again and again in old records, the Salisbury clock. Built in the 13th century, it is said to be one of the oldest working mechanical clocks in the world. It has no face, no hands, no numbers, only a wheel and a hammer that strikes the hours. Its design is simple, pure medieval genius, made of wrought iron shaped by patience and prayer. For more than 700 years, it has ticked steadily in the quiet heart of Salisbury Cathedral. Through plagues, through Reformation, through revolutions, it has refused to stop. If you stand beside it today, you can hear its voice, not loud, but steady, like the breath of something that has learned to live beyond need. The gears turn with a rhythm older than language. The escapement clicks like a heartbeat echoing from another age. Its caretakers, men who've dedicated their lives to keeping it alive, still wind it by hand, pulling ropes that lift weights higher into the wooden tower. As the weights descend, the gears move, and the hammer strikes the bell. Each strike is a reminder that the machine knows how to survive. The clock has no power but gravity and will. It runs because it was made to, and because it remembers how. The story of how it endured begins not with invention, but with devotion. Medieval clockmakers did not build their machines to mark time for merchants or travelers. They built them for prayer. The bell's rhythm guided monks through the hours of worship, matins, lauds, vespers, and so the first clocks were acts of faith. The men who built them believed that time was not owned by man, but loaned by heaven. Every tick was a confession that the world still turned according to a plan. Perhaps that is why the old clocks still run. They were built not for speed, but for reverence. Each motion is a kind of prayer repeated endlessly through centuries. As towns grew, the clocks outgrew their chapels and found new homes in towers. They became civic guardians, their bells calling not just to monks, but to everyone: bakers, soldiers, travelers, children. When war came, the bells were silenced to keep them safe. When peace returned, they rang again. Even when their towers burned, the gears were often rescued, cleaned, rebuilt, and returned to service. The machines were not just valued, they were loved. To hear them stop was like hearing the town itself fall silent. The mystery, though, is not just that they survive, but how they do. Iron rusts, wood warps, oil dries, and yet these clocks continue. The secret lies in care, the unbroken chain of hands that have wound, polished, and repaired them for centuries. Each caretaker adds something of himself: a new pin, a cleaned gear, a note scribbled on the wall marking when he last adjusted the balance. The result is not a single machine, but a collaboration across generations. thousands of small decisions preserving a single pulse. When you hear one tick, you are hearing the echo of everyone who ever kept it alive. There's a story told by one of the modern keepers of Salisbury's clock. He said that during the Second World War, when blackout curtains covered every window and the city stood silent under threat of bombs, the only sound in the cathedral was the ticking of that clock. It became a comfort, a heartbeat of endurance. When sirens wailed, he would climb to the tower to make sure the mechanism was safe, brushing away dust and oiling the gears. It never stopped, he said, even when the lights went out. That was its duty, to remind the living that time continued, even in darkness. In Prague, another clock, the astronomical clock of the Old Town Hall, has told its story in color and motion since the 1400s. It nearly stopped many times. Once during a fire, once when invaders smashed its gears, once when revolution tore its city apart. Yet each time, someone repaired it. Locals say the clock refuses to die because it has seen too much to rest. Its figures of saints, skeletons, and apostles march in rhythm as they always have. Tourists gather beneath it, unaware that they are standing before a survivor older than most nations. When the hour strikes, the skeleton rings its bell and the crowd applauds, not realizing they are clapping for centuries of endurance. Not all who cared for these clocks were engineers. Some were poets of patience. A letter found in the archives of Rouen describes an old man who tended his town's clock for 40 years. "I listen each morning for the first tick," he wrote. "If it comes, I breathe easier. If it doesn't, I climb." He called the clock my oldest friend. When he died, the town honored him not with a statue or plaque, but by engraving his initials inside the clock itself, hidden where only future caretakers would see. In that small gesture was the understanding that timekeepers do not seek fame. Their reward is continuity. Sometimes, the old clocks stop not from failure, but from neglect. And when they are rediscovered, buried under dust, their gears frozen, the moment they tick again feels like resurrection. In 1956, during restoration work in England, workers found a medieval mechanism hidden behind a wall. When cleaned and reassembled, it began to move. The sound of its first tick after centuries of silence made the men pause. They described it as like hearing history breathe. No one alive remembered the sound, yet it felt familiar, as if the world had been waiting for it to return. There is something deeply poetic about a machine that refuses to stop. It reminds us that endurance is not about strength, but care. These clocks do not run on power, they run on attention. They endure because someone always loved them enough to keep them alive. In that way, they are not only timekeepers, but teachers, silent lessons in devotion. They show that the world's most lasting creations are the ones that ask for patience, not perfection. When you stand before one of these ancient clocks, listen carefully. Beneath the steady ticking is a rhythm too slow to measure. The rhythm of centuries breathing through iron and wood. The gears that move today were shaped by hands that turned to dust long ago, yet their work remains in motion. Each cycle is a continuation of a promise. That time will not end so long as someone cares enough to listen to it. The modern world, with its satellites and quartz crystals, keeps time with unmatched precision, but not with the same soul. The old clocks are imperfect. They lose minutes, sometimes hours. Yet there is something deeply human in their flaw. Their imperfection is the reason they need us. They remind us that progress is not about eliminating error, but about maintaining connection. To wind them is to touch the past directly, to feel the same weight of rope and resistance that someone felt 600 years ago. It is a shared gesture across generations, a handshake through time. At night, when the cathedral's empty and the towers stand dark, the clocks continue their quiet work. No one watches them, no one listens. And still, they move, tick after tick, hour after hour, keeping faith with the unseen. In that unseen labor lies their dignity. They do not seek witness or applause. They keep time for the sake of keeping it, because that is what they were made to do. The clock that refused to stop is not just a story about machinery. It is a story about humanity's need for continuity, our refusal to let silence win. In every generation, someone stands beneath the gears, covered in oil and dust, listening for that heartbeat and deciding it is worth saving. They tighten a screw, adjust a spring, wind a rope, and in that moment, history moves again. And when you hear a bell ring in the distance, a slow, measured sound against the wind, think of the hands that kept it alive. Think of the clock that refused to stop and the people who refused to let it die. Because time, in the end, is not only what passes, it is what persists. It is what continues to tick long after everything else has gone quiet. For centuries, bells have hung high above us, heavy, patient, eternal. They have marked our hours, our prayers, our joys, and our grief. Yet few who listen to their voices have ever seen their hearts. Inside every bell lies a world of craft and mystery, a hollow chamber of air and vibration where centuries still echo. To understand the clockmakers, you must understand their companions, the bells that turn silence into sound and time into memory. In the age of stone towers and hand-forged iron, every bell was born from fire. The process began in the foundries at the edges of towns, where heat shimmered above the rooftops like a mirage. The bell makers, known as campanarii, worked beside furnaces that glowed day and night. Their faces were blackened with soot, their hands scarred by molten metal, yet they spoke of their craft with reverence. They said each bell had a soul, and that to cast it wrongly was to trap that soul forever in disharmony. The making of a bell began not with metal, but with silence. The bell makers shaped a core of clay and brick, called the false bell, over which he laid layers of wax and grease. Into this wax he carved decorations, saints, inscriptions, prayers, names of patrons. He then built another layer of clay around it, forming a mold like a cocoon. When the furnace roared, the wax melted away, leaving only its ghost inside the clay shell. Then came the moment of creation, molten bronze, glowing white, poured into the hollow mold, filling the emptiness left behind. The foundry filled with light, with heat, with something close to worship. The bellmaker watched quietly as the metal cooled, knowing that whatever shape the sound would take, it had already begun to breathe. When the clay was broken days later, the bell emerged like something unearthed, its surface rough and scarred, its tone still unborn. It was carried to a wooden frame, hoisted into the air, and struck gently for the first time. The sound that followed was not a simple note. It was a chord, a harmony of vibrations layered upon one another. The bellmaker listened carefully. If the tone rang pure, the foundry erupted in cheers. If it rang flat or dull, the master frowned, knowing that something invisible, a thickness too wide, a lip too thin, had changed the balance. A bad bell could not be fixed, it had to be recast. Failure meant beginning again, melting weeks of work back into fire. The craft demanded perfection, and perfection demanded patience. Every bellmaker left his signature in metal. Sometimes it was a name, sometimes a symbol, sometimes a line of prayer. "May my voice be true," one inscription reads. Another, "When I sing, may heaven hear." To them, the bell was not just a tool, it was a messenger. When it rang, its voice carried the intentions of its maker, hopes of peace, of mercy, of remembrance. Those hopes still echo across Europe today, in the same tones first heard by medieval ears. The bells that survive have outlasted empires, yet their purpose has not changed, to remind us of the rhythm that binds all life. Inside the bell, the science of sound hides beneath poetry. When struck, it vibrates not in one simple motion, but in many at once, hundreds of overlapping waves moving through bronze. Some move quickly, creating high tones. Others move slowly, forming deep resonance. The ear hears only harmony, but the body feels the rest. That is why the toll of a large bell seems to move through the chest. It touches frequencies that live deeper than hearing. Medieval bell makers understood this without knowing the words for it. They learned by listening. They struck and listened again, until their bones remembered what their ears could not describe. Each bell had its own purpose. Some were cast for joy, for weddings, harvests, and festivals. Others were made for mourning. The death bell was tuned to the human voice, so that when it rang, it seemed to speak. In small villages, the tone of the bell told everything: who had died, what hour it was, what season had begun. People could tell by sound alone if the bell was calling for prayer or for warning. It was a language without words, and everyone knew how to read it. But not all secrets were meant for the living. In times of plague or war, bell makers sometimes cast small objects inside the metal: a coin, a charm, a relic, believed to protect the bell from misfortune. These hidden items became the bell's heart, unseen but eternal. Historians have found bones, metals, even locks of hair sealed within old bells. No one can say whether it was superstition or faith, but the message is clear. Every bell carried something of its time within it. They were not only instruments of sound, but vessels of memory. When the bells were hung in towers, the act itself became a ritual. Entire towns gathered to watch the ascent. The air filled with ropes, pulleys, and the shouts of workers straining to lift tons of bronze into the sky. When the bell finally reached its resting place, a priest would bless it with holy water and incense. They called this ceremony the baptism of the bell. It was said that the bell was now alive, that its first ring would awaken the air. When it finally struck, the sound rolled across rooftops and fields like thunder, echoing through the hearts of those who had built it. It was not just a sound. It was the beginning of time for that town. Years turned into centuries. Towers leaned, ropes frayed, storms cracked foundations, yet the bells endured. Some were melted for war, their bronze turned into cannons, only to be recast again into bells when peace returned. A cycle of destruction and renewal, sound and silence. Others were buried beneath collapsed towers, found centuries later and rung once more. There is one in Belgium, recovered after 200 years underground. When struck, it sang perfectly in tune. The bellmaker's voice had survived without breath. Inside every bell, there are secrets we can only guess. Microscopic bubbles in the bronze record the cooling air of the day it was cast. The tone still carries the humidity of that foundry, the imperfections of that night's fire. No two bells sound alike, because no 2 days of creation are the same. They are the fingerprints of time. When you hear one ring, you are hearing the atmosphere of the past, made solid and eternal. Even now, bell makers, a few still remain, carry the same traditions. In small workshops in France, Italy, and Poland, they melt the bronze, shape the molds, and listen for harmony just as their ancestors did. They speak quietly as they work, as if the metal can hear them. And perhaps it can. When the finished bell is hoisted for the first time, they often place their hand against it before it rings, feeling its weight, its temperature, its silent promise. They say that moment, the breath before sound, is the most sacred of all. There are towns where bells have never stopped ringing. They have rung through invasions, through storms, through centuries of forgetting. Each strike is a declaration. We are still here. When the great bell of Rouen tolled after the war, people wept openly in the streets. It was not just metal striking air. It was the voice of endurance, of home, of time reclaimed. The bell's sound carries what no words can, the continuity of being. If you ever stand beneath a bell when it rings, you will feel more than you hear. The vibration passes through stone and air, through ribs and skin. It is an ancient conversation between matter and motion. For a moment, the world seems to breathe in unison. The tone fades, but something lingers, a stillness that feels alive. That is the true secret of the bells. They remind us that silence is not the absence of sound, but its completion. The clockmakers knew this. They built their mechanisms not to compete with the bells, but to accompany them. The tick and the toll were meant to balance each other, the quiet and the loud, the internal and the eternal. Together, they made time something you could both feel and hear. And those centuries have passed. Though the gears have grown smaller and the bells fewer, the harmony remains. Somewhere tonight, a bell will ring, a clock will tick, and between them will flow the same breath that has moved through humanity for 1,000 years. The secrets hidden inside the bells are not secrets of metal or design. They are secrets of endurance, of patience, of beauty carried through generations. They remind us that every sound, if it means something, will outlive its maker. The bell maker dies, the bell continues. The listener fades, the echo remains. And in that endless exchange between sound and silence, time finds its voice again. By the dawn of the 17th century, the age of wonder was quietly giving way to the age of reason. The world that once saw time as divine breath now began to see it as something that could be counted, predicted, and perhaps even controlled. The clockmakers, who had spent centuries listening to the heartbeat of their machines, found themselves standing at a threshold they had unknowingly built between mystery and mathematics. Their craft, born from faith, was about to become science. And with that change came both glory and farewell. For generations, the clockmakers had worked by instinct. They trusted the weight of iron in their hands, the song of gears as they turned, the subtle pulse of a pendulum's swing. But as scholars began to study motion, energy, and gravity, the craftsman's intuition was given names and laws. The ticking that once sounded like prayer now sounded like proof. The rhythm of the clock became the rhythm of the universe. What had once been magic became measurement. The last great invention of the traditional clockmakers did not come from a cathedral or a monastery, but from a man working quietly in his home, Galileo Galilei. In 1583, while watching a swinging lamp in the Cathedral of Pisa, he noticed something remarkable. No matter how wide or narrow the arc of its swing, the rhythm stayed the same. Each movement took the same amount of time. The idea of a pendulum clock was born, though Galileo would never live to complete one himself. His discovery, however, would transform time forever. A century later, Christian Huygens built upon Galileo's idea and created the first truly reliable pendulum clock. It was so accurate that it could measure time to within seconds a day, an unimaginable precision for earlier generations. The world changed with that single improvement. Navigation became possible across oceans, astronomy gained a steady heartbeat, and science found a tool it could trust. The ticking of the pendulum became the sound of modern thought. But for the old clockmakers, it was also the sound of goodbye. The pendulum had taken what once required instinct and made it predictable. The old masters, men who had tuned gears by ear and tested weights by touch, found themselves working in a world that no longer needed mystery. Timekeeping was now a discipline of numbers, not of faith. And yet, even as science advanced, the beauty of the craft remained. The best clocks of the 17th and 18th centuries were as much art as mechanism, their brass gleaming, their faces engraved with suns and moons, their chimes as delicate as wind through glass. They stood in parlors, observatories, and royal halls, ticking softly as the world around them accelerated. For centuries, the tower clocks had belonged to towns. Now, clocks entered homes. Time became personal. A farmer could now measure his day precisely. A sailor could chart longitude. A scientist could record motion. The clockmaker's dream, to give structure to the invisible, had succeeded beyond imagining. But in that success, the mystery that once guided them began to fade. No one prayed over gears anymore. No one believed that the tick of a clock was the breath of heaven. Time had been tamed, and taming always brings silence. Still, The last generation of the great clockmakers continued their work with devotion. They refined escapements, invented springs, balanced pendulums with exquisite care. They built clocks that could run for a year on a single winding, clocks that tracked the planets, clocks that struck melodies instead of single notes. They called these creations long-case clocks, what we now know as grandfather clocks. Tall, solemn, and elegant, they became the new towers of the household. Inside, the pendulum swung like a quiet heartbeat behind glass, a reminder that even in an age of reason, time remained alive. In one such workshop in London, a craftsman named Thomas Tompion became known as the father of English clockmaking. His clocks were prized not only for their accuracy, but for their grace. When he built a new mechanism, he didn't simply calculate. He listened. He said a good clock should sound like a calm conversation with eternity. His apprentice, George Graham, continued the legacy, building instruments so precise that they helped astronomers map the stars. By their hands, the art of timekeeping reached perfection. And then, quietly, it began to vanish into industry. Machines soon replaced hands. Factories produced clocks in numbers once unimaginable. What had once been an art known to a few became a product known to all. Time was no longer something to be admired. It was something to be managed. Bells that once marked prayer now marked work shifts. The human day, once ruled by light, was ruled by ticking. For the first time, people spoke of losing time, as though it were currency. The sacred rhythm became schedule. The heart of the world had quickened, but not all clockmakers surrendered to progress. In small workshops across Europe, some continued to build by hand, as their ancestors had done. They polished brass until it gleamed like sunlight. They carved wooden cases that smelled of pine and oil. They still wound their clocks with reverence, knowing that each turn of the key connected them to the past. These were the last true descendants of the medieval masters, men who believed that the ticking of a clock was still a kind of music. When they worked, the room seemed to hum, not with industry, but with patience. In a way, the last invention of the old clockmakers was not mechanical at all. It was philosophical. They taught the world to listen. Before their time, people measured life in seasons and shadows. After them, we measured it in moments. The clock taught humanity to pay attention, to seconds, to motion, to detail. It made us aware of change, of progress, of the fragile thread that runs through each day. And though we now live surrounded by clocks too perfect to need care, the quiet wonder remains. Each tick still reminds us that time is not infinite. It is given, one heartbeat at a time. Somewhere, in an attic or museum, you can still find one of their creations. A pendulum clock, its face faded, its brass dulled. When someone winds it after years of silence, the sound that follows is the same as it ever was. A slow, hesitant tick, then another, then a rhythm steady as breathing. The pendulum sways, the gears turn, and the air begins to hum. For a moment, it feels as though the room itself is remembering how to live. The clock does not care who listens. It moves because that is what it was made to do. The clockmaker's last invention was not a machine. It was the idea that time could be shared. That every human heart, no matter how distant, beats in rhythm with something greater. Their gears, their bells, their pendulums, all were expressions of that belief. They did not build clocks merely to measure life, but to remind us of its harmony. And even now, when digital screens replace ticking hands, that harmony remains beneath the surface of our days, quiet but constant. So when you pass an old clock, in a tower, a hall, or a museum, pause for a moment. Listen to its steady pulse. It is not merely marking the seconds. It is speaking a language older than science, older than reason. The language of care, of patience, of human hands building meaning into motion. The world may have forgotten the clockmakers' names, but their rhythm still surrounds us. Every second we count, every hour we live, carries the echo of their invention. The clockmaker's last invention was not the pendulum or the spring. It was continuity itself, the faith that something built with love and precision could outlast its maker. And in that quiet, enduring faith, the old world still ticks on, steady as ever, somewhere between the silence of the past and the sound of the next hour waiting to begin. There are towns in Europe where time no longer speaks. Their towers still stand, but the hands on their faces have frozen, their bells long since gone silent. Moss covers the edges of the clock dials. Birds nest where the hour once lived. In these places, the rhythm that once shaped every breath of daily life has faded into quiet. The towns did not die. They simply forgot to listen. For centuries, every village and city lived by the sound of its clock. The bells marked the waking of bakers, the prayers of monks, the market's opening, and the curfew at dusk. When a bell rang, everyone moved together, as though sharing one heartbeat. But progress, like a new wind, slowly changed the pattern. Railways came, factories hummed, personal watches appeared on wrists. The great towers no longer ruled the day. Time became private. And when no one climbed the stairs to wind the old mechanisms, the clocks grew still. At first, no one noticed. A bell failed to strike one evening, and people assumed the wind had swallowed the sound. The next day, they checked their pocket watches instead. Weeks later, the silence returned, and still no one climbed the tower. When finally someone did, they found dust thick on the gears, ropes stiff with age, and pigeons roosting where the pendulum once swung. The machine was not broken, it was simply waiting. Time had not ended, only its voice. In one small town in the hills of France, an old clock stopped in 1924. The caretaker had died that winter, and no one replaced him. For years afterward, the villagers set their lives by memory. The baker opened when the sun hit the church door. The schoolchildren left when the shadows reached the fountain. Seasons guided them more faithfully than machines. Decades later, when restoration workers arrived to repair the tower, they found the clock coated in rust but intact. When they cleaned the gears and wound the weights, the first tick was faint, uncertain, like the breath of something waking from a century's sleep. The villagers gathered in the square, and when the bell finally struck, people cried. It was not nostalgia, it was recognition. Time had found its voice again, but not every clock was so lucky. In many towns, the towers still stand, but the mechanisms are gone, sold, stolen, melted for war. Their hollow interiors echo differently now. Rain falls through broken windows, and ivy winds through beams that once held ropes. In one German village, the clock face remains, its hands forever pointing to 10:11, the hour, they say, when the tower caught fire during the war. No one rebuilt it. The people grew used to its silence, as if the town itself had chosen to remember one single moment, frozen forever. Silence changes a place. In towns without clocks, evenings fall softer, unmeasured. People speak more quietly near the towers, as though respecting a sleeping guardian. Children play in the squares beneath them, unaware that above their laughter hangs a heart that once beat for the entire town. The clock faces stare down, blank and calm, reflecting the sky instead of time. They have become mirrors of light, not keepers of hours. And in that transformation, there is a strange peace, as if the towns, freed from ticking, have learned to breathe again at their own pace. Historians who study these forgotten towers say that most were abandoned not through neglect, but through progress. When electricity replaced winding and quartz replaced pendulums, the old mechanical systems were deemed obsolete. Their gears, once polished and oiled, were left to seize. Some were dismantled, their brass sold as scrap. Others were boxed away, labeled out of order, and never touched again. Yet the walls that held them remember. If you press your ear against the stone, you can sometimes feel a faint vibration, the memory of resonance. Sound leaves traces even in silence. In Italy, a town called Venzone rebuilt its tower twice after earthquakes, but the third time, it chose not to restore the clock. Instead, they left the dial empty, its numerals erased by rain. They said the town no longer needed to measure time. It had survived enough to understand it. The empty circle became a symbol, not of loss, but of endurance. The hours may have vanished, but the tower still stood. That, they said, was enough. For travelers who wander through these quiet places, the experience is uncanny. You arrive expecting the familiar sound, the deep, comforting strike of a bell marking the hour, but there is only stillness. The streets feel suspended, as though the day itself is holding its breath. Shadows move across the cobblestones without hurry. You begin to notice things usually lost to ticking: the rustle of leaves, the echo of footsteps, the whisper of distant water. Time is still passing, but softly, as if on tiptoe. These towns teach you what the clockmakers always knew: that time's truest form is silence between sounds. Some residents still remember the last moments of their clocks. In Spain, an old woman once told a visitor that she could still hear her town's bell in her dreams. It had stopped when she was a child, yet the sound returned in sleep, not as noise, but as rhythm. "It is the sound of home," she said, even if no one else hears it. For her, the silence of the tower did not mean loss. It meant that memory had taken over the duty of the bell. There are those who have tried to bring the clocks back. Restoration groups climb towers with tools and lanterns, brushing away decades of dust. They find birds' nests woven through gears, initials carved into wood by long-dead caretakers, cobwebs strung like lace over pendulums. When they turn the wheels again, the air changes. The towers seem to awaken. Some repairers describe feeling a pulse in the floor, a slow vibration rising through stone. It is as though the building itself is remembering its rhythm. When the first bell rings after decades of silence, it sounds rough, uneven, but real. The echo carries down through the streets, and people stop to listen. For a moment, past and present share the same breath. Yet many towers remain untouched, their silence preserved by choice. In parts of Northern Europe, communities decided not to restore them, believing that silence was part of their history too. "Let it rest," one mayor said. "It has spoken long enough." So the clocks remained still, their hands faded, their bells mute. But at dusk, when the last light touches their faces, the faint outline of the numerals glows. Time, though unspoken, is still visible. The towns did not erase it. They simply learned to live beside it. At night, these places are almost dreamlike. The towers rise as dark silhouettes against the stars. The wind moves softly through the empty bell frames, creating a hollow hum like the ghost of a tone. Some say the sound is imaginary, the mind filling the void. But perhaps it is memory itself, still ringing in frequencies too low for ears to catch. The air in those towns carries a strange calm. Without the constant reminder of passing hours, people speak slower, walk gentler, sleep deeper. The absence of ticking has become a kind of music in itself. In one small village in Switzerland, the clock tower's silence has lasted over a century. Yet every New Year's Eve, just before midnight, the townspeople gather beneath it. They do not strike the bell or wind the gears. They simply stand together in the square and listen. When the church across the valley rings its midnight chime, they bow their heads, not in mourning, but in gratitude. They say they can still feel their own tower breathing quietly above them, unseen but alive. It is no longer a machine. It is memory turned to stone. The towns that forgot their clocks remind us that forgetting is not always loss. Sometimes it is a kind of rest. The clocks served their centuries faithfully, keeping order through chaos, teaching people to listen to rhythm. Now, in silence, they teach something else: patience. They show that time does not need to be measured to be lived. It flows whether we hear it or not. And perhaps, after so many years of ticking, the towers have simply earned their peace. If you ever walk through such a town, stop beneath the tower and close your eyes. Feel the wind. Imagine the weight of the bell above you, the pendulum resting still, the gears asleep in darkness. In that moment, you will understand what the old clockmakers never could have planned, that even when time's voice is gone, its presence remains. The silence itself becomes the measure. And in that silence, you may hear the faintest echo, not of loss, but of completion. The towns that forgot their clocks did not lose time. They returned it to the world. The sun still rises, the shadows still move, and the stars still keep their quiet watch. The towers simply learned what their makers never could, that even without ticking, the world keeps perfect time. Once, time had a sound. It lived in the ringing of bells, in the patient turning of gears, in the heartbeat rhythm that filled the quiet air of towns and monasteries. But now, it moves silently. It hides behind screens, hums through circuits, pulses through invisible waves. Somewhere between the chime of bronze and the flicker of pixels, humanity learned to forget what time used to feel like. For centuries, people listened to the hours. They looked up at towers that watched over them, trusting the deep voice of the bell to keep life in rhythm. When the bell struck, they ate, worked, prayed, rested. The sound carried across valleys and rivers, reminding everyone, no matter how far apart, that they belonged to the same day. But slowly, the rhythm fractured. Time splintered into thousands of tiny pieces, one for every wristwatch, every pocket, every glowing device. The world grew louder, but time itself went quiet. The change began innocently, almost beautifully. The invention of portable clocks was meant to free people, to let them carry precision wherever they went. And for a while it did. A watch was a marvel, a personal guardian of rhythm. But as time became smaller, closer, and faster, something was lost. No one needed to listen to the bells anymore. No one waited for the tower to speak. The old clock faces still turned, but their audience had moved on. Humanity no longer shared one heartbeat. Each person had their own. Factories brought another change. The great engines of industry demanded punctuality, not patience. Time became a tool, measured, divided, enforced. The ringing of bells no longer called people to prayer or celebration. It summoned them to work. The day became a grid of hours, marked not by sunlight or seasons, but by whistles and shifts. The clock's gentle wisdom hardened into command. Its voice, once soothing, became a reminder of what must be done and when. The sacred rhythm turned mechanical. The old clockmakers would not have recognized the world that followed. Their gears had been made to move like breath, steady, living, imperfect. Theirs was a time that could sigh, pause, or drift, just as people do. But modern clocks allowed no drift, no breath, no silence between ticks. The rhythm became absolute. Perfection replaced peace. And soon, time itself began to feel different, faster, thinner, relentless. The world had found precision, but lost its patience. In the 20th century, when the first digital clocks appeared, they made no sound at all. The tick, that heartbeat of centuries, disappeared. Time was now pure number, pure light. The silence was strange at first. People who grew up with the ticking of bedside clocks found it hard to sleep without that soft, steady noise. Some even kept their old clocks wound just to fill the room with rhythm. But eventually, silence won. And when it did, humanity stopped noticing that something had gone missing. Yet not everyone forgot. In small corners of the world, the last mechanical clock towers still stood, tended by quiet caretakers who refused to let them die. They climbed their stairs each week, winding the great weights by hand, listening for the faint hum of gears. When the bell struck, they smiled, not because they needed to know the time, but because they remembered what it meant to hear it. The sound connected them to something older, something that could not be measured in seconds. It was not about time. It was about presence. If you visit one of these towers now, you might find an old man sitting near the mechanism, oiling a gear, wiping dust from a pendulum. He will tell you stories of storms that nearly stopped the clock, of winters so cold the metal froze, of nights when he climbed the tower just to make sure the bell would still ring at dawn. He doesn't do it for fame, or duty, or even history. He does it because he believes in the sound. It keeps the town breathing, he'll say softly, even if no one listens anymore. The world that forgot time didn't lose it entirely. It simply buried it beneath speed. We now measure milliseconds, divide seconds, live inside a precision that medieval minds could never have imagined. We cross oceans in hours, speak across continents in moments, calculate movements of planets and atoms alike. Time has become our servant, our ruler, our constant companion, but also our quietest ghost. We live surrounded by it, yet rarely feel it. It hums invisibly in machines, guiding everything from the traffic light to the heartbeat of the internet. The ticking never stopped, it just moved beyond hearing. Sometimes, though, when the world grows quiet, when power flickers or the network goes still, the silence returns, and it feels ancient. In that hush, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of a bell from centuries ago, ringing somewhere across the distance. It is not a sound you hear with ears, but with memory. The world may have forgotten the language of time, but the heart remembers. The body still knows how to listen for rhythm. We are, after all, creatures of pulse and breath. Perhaps that is why people still stop in old towns to stare at clock towers, even when their hands no longer move. Something in us recognizes them, the tall silhouettes against the sky, the faces weathered by rain, the faint outline of numerals half faded. They are monuments not just to time, but to our longing to understand it. The silence of a stopped clock is not a failure. It is a reminder that we, too, are temporary, that everything built to measure life will one day rest. But even in rest, beauty remains. The world has grown too fast for the kind of time the clockmakers knew. Yet, in quiet moments, their legacy returns. In the rhythm of waves, in the sway of trees, in the soft repetition of footsteps on old streets, time still moves as it once did, gently, imperfectly, alive. The old world's patience still hums beneath the noise of the new one, waiting to be remembered. It doesn't ask to be restored, only noticed, because to notice time is to honor it. In some monasteries, far from cities, the ancient water clocks and mechanical bells still run. Monks rise before dawn, guided not by phones or alarms, but by the sound of time itself. They describe it not as a measurement, but as companionship. When the bell rings, one monk said, "It is not calling us to hurry. It is calling us to be present." That simple idea, that time is not something to chase, but something to dwell in, was the clockmaker's truest invention. And though the modern world may have forgotten it, the echo remains wherever silence falls. If you listen closely tonight, beyond the hum of machines, beyond the ticking of your own pulse, you might still catch it, a sound older than memory, quieter than breath. The whisper of a pendulum that once swung through 1,000 years, keeping rhythm not for progress, but for peace. It is still there, waiting in the silence between seconds, reminding you that time was never meant to rush. It was meant to breathe. The world that learned to forget time did not destroy it. It simply stopped listening. But the clocks, the old, patient, faithful clocks, never stopped speaking. They continue in their own quiet way, ticking unseen in towers and attics, whispering to anyone who will pause long enough to hear. You are here. You are alive. And for this moment, that is enough. And perhaps that is the truest time of all, not what the world measures, but what it remembers. And so, the ticking fades into silence. The bells sleep, the gears rest, and the long story of the clockmakers comes to its quiet end. If you've listened this far, thank you, truly, for walking through time with me tonight. Tell me in the comments what moment stayed with you most, or what sound from history you wish could return again. If this calm journey helped you drift, leave a like. It helps the story find its way to others who still listen for silence. And don't forget to subscribe, So you'll be here for the next forgotten piece of history waiting to breathe again. Until then, rest well, dream slowly. And remember, time still ticks softly, even when we forget to listen.